All right, hi everyone. Welcome to our 11:30 press briefing, Field to Faucet, Agriculture and Algal Blooms. Our participants today are Noel Aloysius, postdoctoral research scientist in the Department of Food, Agricultural and Biological Engineering at the Ohio State University, and Hans Paerl, the Kenan professor at the Institute of Marine Sciences at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
Thank you all for coming. Good morning, everyone. And algae blooms that are dominated by cyanobacteria have become a major problem worldwide in a lot of aquatic ecosystems, primarily as a result of excessive nutrient loading from upstream watersheds. As you see on the satellite image here, what we see is the 2015 algae bloom, which is the largest recorded during the past 20 years, which start from the left side of Lake Erie. Primarily, the upstream watersheds are agriculture dominated, with about 75% of the land cover with row crops such as corn, soybean, and wheat, which uses a lot of fertilizer, nitrogen, and phosphorus. This particular species of algae, cyanobacteria, it can release toxins that are harmful to humans and ecosystems and threaten potable water, fisheries, and recreation. As you can see in the right figure, the bloom severity in Lake Erie has been increasing since 2002. The blooms are more intense and more severe and more widespread. And we suspect, as our research shows, this increasing multiple factors that are causing this problem. If you look at three major human influences of this problem, urban, agricultural, and industrial expansion, which results in increased nutrient inputs to the lake, mostly nitrogen and phosphorus. In freshwater aquatic systems, the problem is caused by mostly phosphorus, but increasingly nitrogen as well. Our changing patterns of water use and modification of the landscapes, for example, in western Lake Erie watersheds, it used to be swamps several hundred years ago, which are drained to have agricultural activities. Those land use modifications increases the runoff, which brings more nutrients to the lake. And increasingly, we also see evidence of climate change playing an interactive role. As a result, blooms are intensifying and spreading. The ecosystem impacts include, it affects clean and safe potable water, beach closures, and tourism and property values. The tourism and tourism and recreational and commercial fishing in Lake Erie alone, it's a $2 billion industry, which is increasingly affected by the algae problem. This is another figure that shows the city of Toledo on the right side, where one of the largest rivers in the Lake Erie watershed drains into the river Maumee. Actually, usually every year the bloom starts from the mouth of Maumee and spread eastward from the western part of Lake Erie to the central basin. It's a global problem. It affects freshwater ecosystems, lakes, reservoirs, streams, and rivers. It affects estuaries as well as coastal waters. You might have heard about the Gulf of Mexico hypoxia. It's another bigger issue in coastal water systems. Globally, it affects both in the developed as well as developing countries. Increasingly, developing countries, places like China, in many countries in Africa, are increasingly being affected, mostly as a result of expansion of agriculture, urbanization, and unplanned human activities. With that, I'm going to hand over to Hans, who's going to talk more about.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Hans Paerl. I'm a professor of, almost forgot what I am, professor of marine science and environmental sciences at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and I work at the Institute of Marine Sciences in Morehead City. And we have been involved in looking at these blooms for quite a long time, but I thought you might be interested in seeing what happens when you get a bloom that just goes over the top, so to speak, and has caused major perturbations and disruption in a part of the world that is increasingly experiencing these blooms. This is a remote sensing picture of Lake Tahoe, the third largest lake in China. This lake is in Jiangsu province, which is the most rapidly growing economically province in China. Everything's expanding there. Major cities around the lake. I don't know if I can actually show you this with the cursor. No? Okay. But you can see there are two major cities on this lake. Each one of them now has about 6 million people living in it. Oh, thank you. Right here, Wuxi and Suzhou, they had about 1 million people about a decade ago, and now there's 6 million people. So one of the big issues is wastewater that comes from these major cities. That accounts for about 30% of the nutrients that are feeding these blooms that are now present in the lake for 9 months out of the year. This lake used to be a pristine a lake dominated by diatoms, which are good algae that we like to have in lakes. And within a decade, this lake has gone through a state change to one that is now dominated by these cyanobacteria. And when you're out there on the lake in a boat, and you hit one of these patches, it actually slows the boat down. There's just so much biomass sitting there in the water. It's incredible. The blooms are dominated by one organism or one genus called Microcystis. It's exactly the same genus that we see in Lake Erie. And if we go back one slide, most of these lakes that are now impacted by cyanobacteria have this genus in them. Now, the reason why I mention Microcystis is because it's an algae that requires not only phosphorus, but also nitrogen in order to grow and form these bloom proportions. It does not have the ability to fix atmospheric nitrogen, which a lot of blue-green algae have. Nitrogen fixation is the use of atmospheric nitrogen that they can then pull down into their body, so to speak, through this process of nitrogen fixation. And it was thought for a long time in freshwater biology that, you know, why worry about nitrogen if these organisms can fix nitrogen from the air? But it turns out now that we have different players responding in these blooms, and these players, like Microcystis, requires nitrogen from the watershed or from external sources. And that's one reason why we're getting increasingly concerned about nitrogen as well as phosphorus in terms of what's supporting these blooms. The other thing I should mention is that this organism, I think there's a microscopic picture of it at the end, it produces a variety of toxins. Most of these are liver toxins that affect liver function, including chronic liver diseases, but also liver cancer. And China has one of the highest rates of liver cancer in the world, which is largely because people in China drink surface water. They don't drink well water, they drink surface water, and most of that comes from these lakes that are now experiencing the expanding blooms. In 2006, we had a situation in Lake Tahoe where the drinking water plant, just like in Toledo, was totally overwhelmed by a bloom that got sucked into the drinking water plant. They chlorinate, of course, to kill everything, but by doing so, you release the toxin into the water. So the finished water that was coming out of the drinking water plant was higher than the toxins coming into the water supply. And this is one of the big problems that we're now facing with municipal drinking water plants, that the chemical processes that we use to actually kill the microorganisms to make the water safer also causes the release of these toxins. So as a result of this major gigantic bloom, the lake, which normally supplies drinking water for about 20 million people, was within overnight, so to speak, off limits in terms of drinking water sources. So that's like Toledo times 20 in terms of the human impact once this event occurred. I don't need to tell you too much about it. That it's ugly, it's a water quality problem, it's a human and animal health problem, And one thing I might point out is that just like in the U.S., the politicians came down from Beijing to try to convince the people that it was okay to drink the water, but nobody believed them. We have very similar scenarios in the U.S. where, you know, the politicians come and do a fish fry or something, or do drinking water tests. Anyway, now the folks living in the Tahoe Basin no longer drink the lake water at all, and the water has to be brought into the basin in the form of either bottled or canistered water. So a major problem. The other thing I want to point out is that in addition to the issue of too many nutrients coming in, and again I mentioned nitrogen and phosphorus, there's also a link to climate change. And that is because the cyanobacteria, which cause the major bloom problems, if you look at temperature here on the x-axis, and you look at growth rate in terms of doublings per day, or how many times these algae double in one day, you can see that the cyanobacteria relative to other algal groups, and these other algal groups are ones we like to have in lakes, they are optimized at a very high temperature. So the warmer it gets, the more they can compete with the other algae in terms of optimizing their growth rates. So as a result of the combination of excess nutrient loading and warming, we have sort of a synergistic effect going on that's stimulating these blooms. And in fact, all the symptoms of climate change, including global warming, more extreme rainfall events, more extreme droughts, they essentially play into the playbook of these cyanobacteria. And one reason is that they've been around a long time. The cyanobacteria have been around 2 billion years. They've seen it all. Stuff that's making us feel uncomfortable these days with warming, they have experienced life in an atmosphere that was much warmer than we even have today. So it can get warmer, and they'll like it even more. Okay, I think I'm going to turn it back to you, Noel.
So the key drivers in Lake Erie is the warming and the changing pattern of precipitation. We have clearly see evidence of more intense rainfall in the spring months, March through May, which transports about a lot of nutrients. To give you a magnitude, the amount of nutrient that goes into Lake Erie from Maumee River alone is about 2,000 metric tons every year. And most of it goes into the lake in the spring months, March through June and July, which provides sufficient nutrients once the lake gets warmer to form larger blooms. Temperature, on the other hand, also helps in some ways. If you can see the temperature trends during the past 25 years, the water temperature, it exceeds 20 degrees Celsius, which propagates the algae growth potential. And then it picks up around 25 to 30 towards the end of the summer. That favors in all ways excessive nutrient loading in the spring and warmer temperatures in the summer. It's the perfect conditions for this toxic algae. So how we approached this, we looked at the global climate model projections that provided inputs to the IPCC's 5th assessment report that was released last year, used those climate change projections under 2 different emission pathways. One, if we consider business as usual, no mitigation or adaptation, we continue to use the fossil fuels the way we use now, and mitigation and adaptation. We use a lot of more renewable resources as well as afforestation programs. And provided those inputs to a watershed simulation model that realistically simulates the agricultural practices and the water cycle and the nutrient cycle in the watershed, which provides the necessary inputs to a bloom prediction model, which is being used currently by NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency, to predict predict blooms in Lake Erie in the summer. They have been successfully predicting this bloom early in June, early July, every year for the past 10 or 15 years. So we use these outputs to see what's the situation if you don't change the current agricultural practices, continue with the same agriculture. This is a simplistic form of what we find. Overall, we find the current, compared to the current situation, the severity of algae bloom is going to increase in the future. This is for one a 20-year projection window during which how many severe blooms you would get that are larger than 1,500 square kilometers in extent. To give you a perspective, a 300 square kilometer of peak bloom algae generates about 4,000 metric tons of dry matter, which eventually settles down to the lake bottom, which also assimilates about 2% of the nutrients that goes in. It's only 2% of what is going in from the Maumee. The rest is still there somewhere under the lake bottom. We don't know what's going to happen in the future for those birds. So overall, what we see is under both emission scenarios, we see an increase in more frequent events. What are the implications of that? We need to look at climate change as a potential, we need to include in future plannings to address these harmful algae problems, either in Lake Erie or elsewhere in China or any other region where that goes through this algae problem. We need to consider climate change as a factor in when planning future nutrient runoff reduction programs. I'll hand it to you again.
So what can we do about this? What are the mitigation strategies that are out there to try to knock back these blooms and bring these systems back into some kind of acceptable and safe state in terms of drinking water and human use and fisheries and all the other resources that we have in these aquatic systems? This again are some pictures of Lake Tahoe, by the way, and Tahoe is 2,300 square kilometers. That's a big lake. You cannot just scoop the algae out and solve the problem that way. So there have been a variety of strategies that have been put into place or that are being practiced as mitigation strategies, and I'll just go through these with you from the upper left across down here. These are all the factors that affect these blooms. Obviously, nutrients is important. The water column, whether it's stratified or mixed, is very important, and that warming, of course, will make the water warmer on the surface, and if you have warm water on the surface and colder water underneath, it causes the lake to become more stratified and resistant to mixing, and that benefits these cyanobacteria as well. The residence time is really important. The amount of time that a drop of water that enters the system stays in the system is important, because that's what flushes everything out of the lake as well as bringing things into the lake. And it turns out that the growth rates of these cyanobacteria, even though they like it hot, their growth rates are still relatively low. So one strategy is to increase the flow in the lake and have a higher flushing rate, which allows faster growing good algae to outcompete the cyanobacteria. And that has worked in some reservoirs and small systems. But as you can imagine, trying to increase the flow in a large lake like Tahoe, or for that matter, large reservoirs like Lake Mead and others that are developing these problems, there just isn't enough water around to do that. And in fact, water supply is so precious right now that, and will continue to be, that this is really only a limited approach in small systems. And the same is true with forcing mixing of the water column. There's a variety of gadgets out there now that can increase the mixing rate so that the cyanobacteria cannot form these blooms on the surface, and they're forced to compete with other algae in the water. Those work pretty well for aquaculture ponds and small systems, for example, but again, if you get into a big system, there's just not enough mixing power that can be exerted to allow that to be a good strategy. Ultrasonic treatment has been used, rupturing the cells and killing them that way, but remember, the toxins that these organisms have in them are endotoxins, so if you kill them, you're then faced with the toxin being dissolved in the water. And in a way, you've got a much bigger problem then than you do if you could concentrate them somehow or remove them physically. So while this kills them, and I might as well go to this approach too, and that is adding certain chemicals that'll kill the algae, like copper sulfate or hydrogen peroxide. It's a temporary fix. The algae might go away because you're killing them, but you're releasing the toxin in the water. And in fact, the algae have spores that live in the sediments, so as soon as the toxic effect of the chemical is over with, they'll be back. And the other problem with copper sulfate, of course, is that you end up having copper in your lake, which is not a very good thing, and there are many situations where there could be copper toxicity, for example, to bottom-dwelling fauna and flora. So the chemicals are good if you're looking at a pond that's not used, say in a golf course or something, and you just want it to look nice, but it's not a long-term fix, and in fact it can be detrimental impacts. There have been strategies where the sediments have been covered or coated with a substance. One of them is called phoslock, where the phosphorus is locked up in the sediments. That works okay in some small, deep lakes that are permanently stratified so that you don't mix the water all the way down to the bottom. But in shallow lakes like Tahoe, you can have sediments resuspended into the water column from wind mixing. So, and this is a very expensive technique to use. So basically, you can't use that in large systems that are wind exposed. Dredging has been used to get the sediments out of the lake. And then you know, have a smaller sediment pool essentially to regenerate and recycle the nutrients. What you have to do with dredging, of course, is take the dredge spoils and put them somewhere out of the basin. And that's not an easy task in a place like Tahoe, for example, which has a huge basin. If you don't get the sediments out of the basin, eventually they're going to leach their nutrients back into the lake. So this is very expensive. Not practical in big systems, and in fact can be detrimental, particularly to the bottom-dwelling organisms, since you're removing their habitat and disturbing it. I'll skip this one. So the bottom line is, you know, there are lots of mechanical approaches now to dealing with these blooms. Most of them are temporary. They're quick fixes. The bloom will be back. And unless you have parallel nutrient input reductions from the watershed going on, these mechanistic techniques, many of which are very expensive, will only be a short-term fix. The only long-term fix is having a comprehensive nutrient reduction strategy in the watersheds of these systems for both nitrogen and phosphorus. And just to give you some idea of how important agricultural watersheds are in this regard, in most places, what we call non-point source loading, that is diffuse nutrients that are put on land, like fertilizers and waste, for example, constitute about 80% of the total nutrient load in these lakes. You know, we've already treated sewage in many places, like Toledo, for example, but what's coming off the land from agricultural practices is now making up a bulk of the nutrient loads that are coming into the system. So that's the big part of the pie that needs to be addressed if we're going to have a long-term comprehensive strategy to try to deal with these blooms and reduce them. The good news is that if we do practice some of these techniques, like buffer zones, vegetative buffer zones around agricultural lands, which will help retain the nutrients and strip them out, best management practices for fertilizers, applying them at the right time, at the right rate, knowing something about the rainfall patterns and seasonality so that you don't lose all your nutrients coming into the lake. All those are really good combined strategies to try to minimize this big problem. If you want to treat for phosphorus, if you think you got a phosphorus problem, well, the good news is most of these techniques to get phosphorus out will also get the nitrogen out, because the plants will take up phosphorus and nitrogen on the land. Or if you, vice versa, are looking at nitrogen reductions, you'll get some phosphorus reductions with these non-point reduction strategies. So that's where the target is, non-point source loading. In North Carolina, it accounts for, like I said, about 80% of the nutrient input. You know, many municipalities are already treating their sewage, and it's very expensive to get a little tiny bit of more reduction of phosphorus and nitrogen from those plants, when in fact there's a huge source coming in from agriculture that actually would be less expensive per acre to deal with than dealing with sewage treatment plants. So I think I'll stop there. I thought maybe if you wanted to see what some of the players look like, what some of these algae look like under the microscope, this is Microcystis. This is the one that is really on the march globally. It's the one that's causing the problems in Lake Erie, Lake Tahoe, many other lakes worldwide. It is not a nitrogen fixer. It needs nitrogen. So that's telling us something about nitrogen. Got to reduce nitrogen inputs as well as phosphorus. And then these other characters usually accompany Microcystis, who have filamentous types, and then filamentous types with these interesting cells on them called heterocysts, and those are the nitrogen-fixing ones. But in most cases, the nitrogen-fixing algae don't really fix much nitrogen because there's too much nitrogen already in the water that's supporting these blooms. And I think I'll stop there. And do you have anything else you want to say before
we'll take questions?
Take questions?
Okay.
Glad to answer any questions.
Yeah, so we'll open it up to questions. Are there any questions from reporters in the room? Do we have any questions from the chat? Oh, yeah.
Hi, Brett Walton, reporter with Circle of Blue, wider news agency. Has there been any economic analysis done to see where the best bang for the buck is, so to speak, in all these different suite of options for reducing phosphorus and nitrogen?
Yes, there has been in numerous watersheds. They usually, if you're going to invest in something like a buffer, vegetative buffers, for example, you have to give up some of your land to do so. So that's included in the economic analyses. But it turns out, actually, that the more efficient use of fertilizer, for example, and applying it at agricultural or agronomic rates, those are rates at which you still get optimal plant growth on land, but you minimize the runoff, actually saves incredible amounts of money, into the billions of dollars in the U.S. alone. The losses economically from these blooms in the U.S. have been estimated to be about $4 to $5 billion annually in terms of aesthetics, drinking water supplies, et cetera, et cetera. So dealing with some of these non-point strategies is actually economically quite feasible if you take the big picture into consideration. And we can actually end up, with less economic losses overall. I think you really have to look at the economic question in terms of both how much it's going to cost to deal with the nutrients, but also how much you're actually building up in value of the systems that you're protecting. And it looks like overall there's more money coming into these watersheds if you can control the blooms than what you're losing. If you're interested in numbers, I can give you some references for that.
In Lake Erie, particularly, we looked at like filter strips, which, as you mentioned, takes up some land. There are different fertilizer application methods, like compared to broadcasting. How would it, if you inject fertilizer, that reduces a lot of phosphorus runoff, particularly from the agricultural watersheds. So we are actually evaluating several of these best management practices, consulting with farmers which ones you are most likely to adopt, and what are the suite of best management practices that will help us reduce these total loads substantially. So we're evaluating various, not only economic aspects, at the same time the social aspects as well, whether farmers and end users are willing to adopt. If they are not, what is the reason? So we got to figure out in the long term why and why not people are adopting or not adopting. So the research is in that stage now. We are looking at it.
Okay, are there any more questions from reporters in the room? Do we have any questions from the chat? No? Okay. Okay, well, this concludes our press conference. Our next briefing will be at 1:30 p.m. on changing lake temperatures. Thank you, guys.